Welcome to Paramook 2023, also known as Parapsychology Research and Education. Our topic this year was apparitions, hauntings, and poltergeists. Our live session started on February 28th, and the final one will be Saturday, April 1st. I'd like to thank our organizational team, Bryan Williams from the Psychical Research Foundation and Natasha Chisdis from Chisfilm. And I would like to thank the president and executive director of the Parapsychology Foundation, Lisa Coley and Anastasia Damalis, who have been supportive of our program since 2015. And we're really grateful for that. So Bryan Williams, who you all know, is the research director of the Psychical Research Foundation. He previously studied psychology at the University of New Mexico and was a research study of the late parapsychologist William Roll. In 2008, he was a co-recipient of the Eileen J. Garrett Scholarship Award offered by the Parapsychology Foundation. In addition to various journal articles and online materials, he is the author of the monograph Psychic Phenomena and the Brain, published in 2015, and has also contributed chapters to such scholarly anthologies as Mysterious Minds, Evidence for Psi, and Advances in Parapsychological Research 10, which came out in 2021. This informal presentation is called Seeking Spectral Insight, Some Possible Practical Lessons for Ghost Hunting from Parapsychological Research, and today is March 30th. The presentation will highlight some possible lessons gleaned from various parapsychological findings, which might be useful to consider when conducting ghost hunts, particularly when it comes to trying to have a personal sighting or experience with a ghost. The aim here is partly to help sort out what might be fact from what might be folklore when it comes to popular media claims about ghosts and ghost huntings. So I'm going to stop sharing.
We can see the slides now.
That looks good.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so yes, in this presentation here, I'd kind of like to take a little bit of a step back here and be a little bit less technical and a bit more informal, and kind of go back to the basics a little bit to see what kind of things we can, what kind of lessons we can get that might be useful in ghost hunting from parapsychological research findings. So let's kind of step back a little bit. Encounters with ghosts are some of the most intriguing aspects of human experience, since they've been reported from the earliest periods of human history and then right up to the present. One of the most recent surveys that was done in 2022 by the YouGov polling group had found that among Americans polled, about 19% had seen a ghost, and about 25% claimed to have lived in a haunted house. When we look at that same type of thing across the pond in the United Kingdom, we find that the numbers are actually very similar. A survey also conducted back in 2014 had found that roughly around 28% had said that they had seen or felt the presence of a spirit. And as interesting as some of these figures are, it's important to recognize here that this is really a relatively small proportion of the general populace, roughly around a quarter. And so it's a really small number. And that suggests that a lot of ghost experiences tend to be quite elusive. And this doesn't really fare too well when it comes to people who are looking to trying to have an experience for themselves, to make a decision for themselves on whether ghosts actually exist or not, kind of following the old saying, well, I'll believe it when I see it. And when it comes to things like that, they might ask, well, is there anything else that I can do that might possibly increase my chances of encountering a ghost? And I will say here that there might be, but there are some caveats that I should probably make clear from the outset. The big one is the word possible, and that's the key word here. I use that particular word for a couple of reasons. One of them is to reflect our current limits in knowledge. At this point, we still don't know everything there is to know, and nobody yet knows everything there is to know about ghosts, apparitions, and hauntings. And so at this point in time, there are still many more questions than there really are definite answers at this point. So everything that I'll be talking about here has kind of that limitation in it. And so based on that, the lessons that I'll be discussing here, I can't offer any guarantee that they're really going to be able to definitely increase somebody's chances of having a ghost experience. But if the initial findings on which they are based are in the right direction, then it would suggest that, well, maybe they have some practical value and may be worth trying, trying to put in practice to see how well they work. And that would be good, because testing ideas and techniques to see whether they work or not is often a good part of ghost hunting. We don't yet know exactly how to really detect or otherwise kind of get a reading on these ghosts. So we want to try different techniques and ideas to see which ones might work and which ones might not. The lessons that I'm going to offer here are experiential ones rather than technical ones. And by that I mean they have to do more with subjective experience and not so much with technical gadgetry and things like that, which tends to be the focus a lot of times today in ghost hunting. They're more along the lines with some of the lessons that Lloyd Auerbach has offered in his books on popular books on ghost hunting, which do offer some really good and a lot more detailed lessons along these lines. And so mine will kind of supplement his. But to get some more fuller details and some more really good practical lessons, his books are a really good resource, especially these two that I show here. But before getting to the lessons, it might be a good idea to kind of put them into a reasonable framework. And one way we might do that is by briefly considering the question, how do we know what we know? More specifically, how do we know what we think we know about apparitions, hauntings, and poltergeists? When you look at some of the TV shows and the magazines and materials related to ghost hunting that are out there, you tend to see a range of claims being made about ghosts and hauntings, and they have a wide spectrum. There are many different perspectives, and the question is which of these claims, if any of them, are correct? How do we know that they're on the right track when it comes to what ghosts and hauntings are really like? And when considering that question, it's also important on our end to recognize and be aware of our own personal beliefs and desires and expectations when it comes to trying to answer that question for ourselves, because we have to recognize that they might also kind of lean toward a specific viewpoint that we might favor. Oftentimes it has to do with, well, ghosts and hauntings represent a form of survival after death. Maybe there's something inherent in the human spirit or soul that kind of survives on after death. And the question is, from science, is that really what's going on? And when we look at that, this question, it draws upon the issue of confirmation bias that was mentioned by Beth Darlington in her presentation earlier in this Paramook. And it draws on that and the aim to be objective in the search for knowledge. When we're addressing the question about ghosts and hauntings and the question of survival, it's very important for us to try and kind of balance both sides of the argument and weigh the data that we have, the evidence, and kind of ask, well, which side is the evidence leaning? Is it more towards the survival end, or is it a more alternate hypothesis, as Beth was suggesting? We have to be careful about that. And so in order to be to really get at the question, we have to try and balance and weigh the evidence as equally as we can, and be careful of not trying to lean too much based on our own personal biases toward one particular end. It's not a good idea to just accept any data or evidence which seems to indicate the one that we might favor the most, the hypothesis we might favor the most, and then just totally ignore the data and evidence which seems to be contradictory to that. And basically, in my view, it really comes down to a question like this. Would you be comfortable with accepting something that may not be true? Because we may have certain viewpoints that we favor, especially when it comes to the question of life after death. I imagine a lot of people want to accept the idea and really hope that that some form of survival occurs. But what if the data is not really pointing in that direction? Right now, it's still a large open question, but what if it eventually turns out that a lot of the data is not really within that direction? In order to be objective, of course, you want to and get a good answer, in terms of kind of pursuing the truth. You got to be careful in terms of just leaning towards one viewpoint. I personally would not be comfortable with accepting something that may not be true, because then that would essentially mean that I'm basically fooling myself, and I'm not comfortable with that idea. So I don't know how everybody else would feel, but I would not be comfortable with it. You kind of might see this a little bit clearer through a very simple and somewhat rather silly illustrative example. I say silly now because it reflects our knowledge. We know that this is not the case, but for a moment, we might let us step back a little bit and pretend like we were still in the pre-Enlightenment days, and we didn't know what we know about the moon. And so if I was trying to learn more about the nature of the moon at that time, and I make an observation, and I kind of wonder, well, is the moon made of Swiss cheese? From a purely observational perspective, that would seem to be at least a little bit sensible, because the moon is white from when you look at it, and it also tends to have holes a lot like Swiss cheese does. And so I would kind of think that, wow, and that would really provide a really good source for humans to sustain ourselves when we eventually travel there to the moon. And so I have a real big hope that maybe the moon is made of Swiss cheese. But how would I know that that's correct? What would be one way I could go about finding out and seeing if I can be more confident about that kind of hope that I have and expectation? Well, of course, the simple way is to put it to the test. And so eventually, when the astronauts land on the moon, we ask them to take samples and bring them back, and then we can test them that way. We can take a little taste of this surface of the moon and see whether it's made of Swiss cheese or not. And as we know now, when we tested here, we find that indeed the moon is not made of Swiss cheese. But that seems to go against my own hypothesis, the one I would favor, because it seems really nice. But if I said that, what should I do? Do I accept this result that the moon is not made of Swiss cheese, or should I simply reject these findings simply because they're inconsistent with my hopes and expectations? What if I kept saying, well, yeah, that suggests that it's not made of Swiss cheese, but man, I know in my heart of hearts that the moon is made of Swiss cheese. Maybe if we keep looking deeper, maybe I bet there will be something there that will confirm my hope and my hypothesis that it's made of Swiss cheese. But when you do that, you have to be careful, because if you cling to your hypothesis in spite of any contradicting data, then you're not really weighing the evidence and kind of considering both sides of the debate, the issue, very well. And so in that way, you're not really being objective, and you have to be very careful about that, because if you if you maintain a viewpoint in spite of any contradictory evidence, then that is not really in line with science. That is more in line with faith or with religious dogma. And so you have to be careful about that if you're going to claim to explore on the basis of science. And we have to be careful about it too, because we've seen this occur previous times in the past too, when it comes to, for example, back in the pre-Enlightenment days, when it came to the issue of a heliocentric versus a terracentric solar system. That is, a sun versus Earth-centered solar system. The church maintained that the Earth was the center of the solar system, but we've since learned, since the time of Copernicus and Galileo and some of the early astronomers, that the Earth is definitely not at the center of the solar system. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that the sun is. And so, but yet, because of a religious doctrine, there are some who might still hold to that idea. Well, maybe that's so, but I think there's something special about humans that in nature, that we're in a special place. God put us in a special place. So I'm going to hold on to that in spite of the evidence. Those findings are just a fluke. And so if you really hold on to something that you cherish like that and kind of ignore any data that falsify it, then that's more in line with faith. And so we have to be careful about that and not edge into religious dogma. And that goes with exploring the universe as a whole. And from that, we also might heed the words that astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, when he said that, well, the universe is under no obligation to make sense to you. And to that, I would also add that nor is it obligated to conform with your beliefs and your expectations and desires. And so that's something to keep in mind, not only when exploring nature and the larger universe as a whole, but also when it comes to exploring human nature and what, if anything, that might happen to us after death. It would seem to me that if we really want to know from an objective viewpoint, then we have to really be willing to go where the data are leading us. And that may not necessarily be the way that we hope that it will go. And so when it comes to especially ghosts and hauntings like that and their possible implications for survival, we have to be careful. So in one sense, I don't really want to be the bearer of bad news, but if it was the case that the data weren't in that direction, we have to be careful about still adhering to the idea that these phenomena might have implications for life after death. That's not to say that they couldn't, but we just have to be careful in terms of we should be mindful that in the case of science, data needs to help shape the theory, not the other way around. If you instead start with the theory and then only select out data which seem to be in support of that theory, then that's already going into a side of bias. And so we have to be careful that when we maintain a certain perspective, that it's we are certainly welcome to do that. We're certainly welcome to form our own personal opinions about things, but we also have to be mindful of the possibility that it may not necessarily reflect reality sometimes. So, and that also kind of goes on both ends of the spectrum too, when it comes to the question, well, do these phenomena exist or not? There's the belief side, the believers, and then also the skeptics as well. When you're on the real extreme poles of that issue, there's kind of a good way to be in the middle ground too. So it's okay to actually, I would argue, it's okay to be still on the fence and not having made up your mind, because over time, more data are likely to accumulate, and kind of the opinion that you form in order to be objective, it should be formed based on that incoming data, whether pro or con, in terms of supporting or disconfirming certain viewpoints. So it's okay to, even though some may get teased a little bit for either being a believer or a skeptic. It's okay to be in the middle. And so, with that said, let's take a look at some of the lessons I'm offering here. Oftentimes, lessons are really good to shape in the form of a question. Are some ghosts more intangible rather than tangible? Could actively trying to seek out ghosts actually lessen your chances of having one and seeing one? How long does a haunting last, and how might that affect your chances of seeing a ghost? Do urban ghost myths and legends have any factual basis? Do ghosts really only appear at night or in total darkness? Are haunted places necessarily old and run-down buildings? Well, let's take a look at each of these in turn, one by one. So, are some ghosts more intangible than tangible? And by that, I mean, are some ghosts more psychological? Are they more in the mind rather than physically tangible? Are they really in our minds, or are they something out in the external physical world? And that's always been a long-standing debate that actually goes back to around the 19th century. One of the earliest references to it I see goes back to that time, involving the psychical researcher Gurney Myers, when he got into a bit of a minor debate with a correspondent who wrote to the journal of the SPR in response to some of the articles on apparitions that Myers and a few others had published. And this correspondent had basically said, well, the ideas that the questions they're raising here are kind of a little bit, they seem kind of a little bit far-fetched, because I myself kind of am pretty confident that that ghosts and apparitions are actually something external, that they actually have physical tangibility. And I just know that myself is kind of what from reading that correspondent's words, that's kind of the impression I was getting. And Frederick Myers wrote back and basically said, well, that's good, but wait a minute, let's kind of step back here and consider a few things when it comes to that position. And he raises some good issues about it that I think we should consider. One of them has to do with the concept of a soul. When we think about survival, we think about something deep within us that we might call a soul or a mind or a consciousness or a spirit, whatever you'd like to call it. There's some kind of inner essence within us that is assumed to survive after death. But yet when we see a lot of reports of apparitions of human figures, they're often clothed and carrying other little accessories like canes. Some of them might have books and things like that. Objects which are inanimate, which are non-biological, they're not living. And so that would raise the question, if there can be such ghosts of things like that, do clothes and other objects have their kind of a soul of their own? And I think that's one thing that I find hard to think about when it comes to the survival thing. If something only like the human soul survives, then how are we going to account for these instances like this, where we see clothed ghosts and ghosts of objects, and also other things like buildings and phantom vehicles, which were also reported often back in the 19th century as well. Myers also pointed out an issue concerning the perceptual illusion of movement, and by that he meant instances where we see apparitions walking through walls or going through doors. And he argued, well, if ghosts are really kind of some type of physical substance, it would be a little hard to wrap our minds around how they do that, because we don't often see physical substance just simply passing through other physical substance too easily. There seem to be penetrating barriers, and working out the physics of that is a little hard to do. And then he tied that to the question, well, are ghosts physically detectable? If they're really some type of physical substance that's out in the external physical world, then can we really detect them? And he basically kind of, when it came down to it and considering these ideas, he basically he said, our current definitions and understanding of what we consider material and what we consider immaterial may actually be quite inadequate to describe what our ghost really is. We simply don't know at this point. There are limitations in our knowledge. So we have to be careful about saying, yes, we definitely know that ghosts are something external. We simply don't know that yet because we recognize that we have limitations in our knowledge, and we don't want to go too far beyond what the data seem to suggest at this point. And that's still an open issue even today. If we look at one of the statements made by the late psychical researcher Tony Carnell in his book Investigating the Paranormal, he had said, well, if apparitions are indeed objective phenomena, then they must in some way be physical material occupying a specific area of space. And yet there are, for example, reports of hands being passed through such figures without disturbing their composition. And yet again, reports that such figures may suddenly appear and then disappear. And so we see a little bit of a contradiction between these 2 points here. And how do we how do we account for that? So that becomes a very important point when it comes to what ghosts are. And kind of when it came to his own findings, he had tried to kind of test that question. Well, are ghosts physically detectable? Through his use of the spider, the spontaneous psychophysical incident data electronic recorder. This was an instrument pack that that was created by Howard Wilkinson and Tony Carnell and Alan Gauld, that they would carry around sometimes at repeatedly haunted sites in order to monitor several physical variables associated with the site itself, to see if any changes in these variables occurred at the time that something potentially paranormal took place. And he had taken this spider to a number of different repeatedly haunted sites, and in many of these, he just didn't find any really clear change in the spider's instruments. And so, if there's something tangible, you would kind of figure that there would be some type of change. Now, we have other cases where physical variables associated with the physical environment of the reputed haunted site have been recorded, but they haven't been clearly tied to the occurrence of the phenomena per se. What we see in the long term is that there are these reputedly haunted sites have unusual physical properties, but exactly how those tie into the phenomena themselves is still an open question. Are they really tied to the ghosts and kind of paranormal phenomena themselves, or are they tied to effects upon the human physiology, the brain and the central nervous system? When they are really extreme, are they having an effect on a person's body and brain, and in ways that may affect their normal physiological function, and thereby induce hallucinations that, through the context of the situation itself, the witness may experience and interpret as a ghostly type of experience? That's still an open question as well. If we step back a little bit further and kind of look at more simpler considerations, we might consider this one. For example, when we have a number of instances where we have apparitional experiences that involve multiple witnesses. And in those instances, when a ghost appears, not everyone may see it. And that would seem to be, on the surface, quite in contradiction to what you'd expect. if a ghost was physically tangible, if it was something external and present in the physical environment. This study here that was done by Hornell, Hart, and several of his colleagues did a survey, and they found that several of the cases that they looked at involving multiple witnesses involved this very situation where not everybody saw the apparition that was reported. Some might then say, well, maybe we shouldn't rely on human perception. Maybe we should rely on the instruments instead and see what they've come up with. And that also too, the equipment themselves and technology has its own limits as well, particularly when it comes to what they were originally designed to detect. And it's not ghosts. That's important to keep in mind. We're simply looking for correlations with the phenomenon, but whether they are really directly tied to that is again an open question. And so this kind of also raises the question, well, if not everybody can perceive the ghosts, then why not have psychics? And I know there are some ghost hunting groups who have kind of frowned upon that a little bit, and I haven't really understand their reasons why. Because if psychics are in some way have some sort of ability that allows them to be sensitive or to otherwise perceive the presence of ghosts, then why wouldn't you have them available? Now, that's not to say that you don't have to be careful about the use of some psychics. You have to kind of screen them a little bit to be sure that their abilities are genuine. But I don't think I don't see any other clear reason beyond that for why they would be excluded from a team or not be used on an investigation, particularly if you are looking for a correlation between the experiences of that people have and also with changes in the environment. And so I would say when it comes to this question, is the use of psychics really something to avoid when it comes to ghost hunting and field investigations? I would say no. It's not really that clear to me that a very convincing case for not using them has been made. Another very simple consideration we might have comes in relation to alleged ghost photographs for which there is an extensive history as well. If ghosts are really something external in the physical environment, then presumably they should be able to be captured on film and on video. And there have been a lot of claims, photographic claims that have been made along those lines. But when you look at them, they tend to be quite different and not like what you'd expect to a ghost to look like, especially when you look at some of the ghostly reports of human figures that appeared in some of the psychical research literature from the 19th century. That type of literature generally describes full detailed figures that look like humans, but yet these photographs don't really they're not really in line with that. They're not very clearly human forms, and you come along with they're more wispy and kind of misty. And then at the bottom here we see that the common so-called orbs or spherical light forms that are often reported among the paranormal community. And so because of this contrast between what you'd expect and what you find on these photographs, you might ask, well, are these really ghosts, or are they simply subtle physical effects that we're capturing here? And that's also important too, in terms of being careful not to hastily jump to conclusions that because you capture something anomalous that it must be a ghost. There might also be other possibilities to consider as well, some of which are normal rather than paranormal. And this highlights also the talk that Gerhard Meyer had given us in this parabook earlier as well, when he came to the issue about photographs and how do you interpret them. Even if you capture something anomalous, you have to be careful about how you interpret it, because there are other factors, especially psychological ones, that can influence the way they can shape your perceptions and the way you interpret it, especially when it comes to such phenomena as pareidolia and things like that. So that's very valuable to take into consideration as well. So from this, the possible take-home lesson is, well, we might consider relying a little less on equipment and a little more on subjective experience. And that's the kind of lesson that Lloyd kind of gives in his books. He pointed out, well, the phenomena investigated by parapsychologists are defined by people and depend on the witnesses having experiences and not on some technology designed for other purposes. And so that comes largely for when we look at, again, the difference between apparitions that were reported in yesteryear, maybe going all the way back to the 19th century, and the ghosts that are reported today. There is a big difference between them. And so it's possible that maybe one of them is more mental and based in the mind, while the others is more physical. It's the full figures might be more psi-based. There might be more psychic, and they might be more in the mind of the witness. Whereas the more ambiguous ones, such as the forms we capture in photographs that look misty and hazy and look like orbs, perhaps those might be more physical or external, environmentally based phenomena. And so we have to make a distinction between them. If we want to focus more on the kinds of ghostly experiences that were reported back in the 19th century, maybe we have to turn our sights inward a little bit more in terms of what we're experiencing mentally. The next one we might look at is, does actively trying to search and seek out ghosts, might that lessen the likelihood that you'll see one? And this is based on case surveys that have been done, again, almost since the 19th century. There was a collection of studies that were done by Celia Green and Charles McCurry back in the 1970s, where they found that 97% of the witnesses' experiences had occurred unexpectedly, meaning that they were not expecting to have the experience that they had. They were not actively seeking out the ghost at the time that they witnessed the ghost appearing before them. They were actually quite surprised in a lot of instances, and it just caught them off guard. The late Earl Haraldson also found a very interesting thing too, in that 47% of the witnesses in the reports that he received, they were working or engaged in some activity, and that activity is something other than ghost hunting. Their attention and their minds were preoccupied with the tasks that they were doing. So they were not particularly looking for ghosts or trying to think about the person who the ghost seemed to represent. Their attention was totally focused on what they were doing, and they were not actually actively trying to have an experience for themselves. And when we see this, it kind of raises the question, might this reflect an unconscious aspect to psychic experience? And the reason why we might ask that is because we also see this similar kind of thing occurring in reports of spontaneous ESP. One example we might look at is the experience described by Mrs. Hirth, which was reported in the small collection of cases on telepathy that the late Ian Stevenson had published. In this particular instance, Mrs. Hirth, she was busy doing the dishes at the time. She had a fleeting sudden impression that her daughter got hit by a car several blocks away, and at that moment she was preoccupied with the task at hand, and she wasn't actively thinking of her daughter, and the experience just kind of manifested on its own. It just, she wasn't trying to provoke it or actively trying to seek it out. It just occurred on its own. And so if there's anything to this, especially when it comes to detailed apparitional experiences that might be mediated through psychic means, perhaps one thing we might consider doing is just letting it happen. We see on a lot of on the ghost hunting TV shows and stuff like that, they're actively making efforts to try to seek out an experience. And perhaps if these findings have anything to them, that might suggest that that's kind of a step in the wrong direction. Perhaps maybe what some investigators should do is actually kind of take a step back and adopt a more passive approach to investigating. And rather than trying to seek out the ghosts and trying to provoke them and things like that, they should actually maybe just kind of take it kind of more relaxed and less focused approach, and just let the phenomena occur if they're going to occur on their own. It seems that these more profound experiences, that's the kind of conditions under which it seems that they tend to occur. The next lesson has to do with how long does a haunting last, and how might that affect your chances of seeing a ghost? This too comes from case surveys as well. We don't yet have any clear answers along this line in terms of how long a haunting lasts, but there may be some reason for thinking that it may not be indefinitely. One of the examples that we can maybe look at here is the classic Cheltenham or Morton ghost case from the Annals of the Society for Psychical Research. This was, of course, the classic case in which the Despard family saw the ghostly figure of a widow dressed in black, wandering throughout their rented house in Cheltenham, England, and over the course of 7 years. And as time passed, Rosina Despard, who chronicled the haunting, she noted, well, as time went by, we started seeing the figure less and less, and it actually started to get a little bit. It seemed to start fading out a little bit, and so until finally they didn't really see it at all anymore. And so it seemed that over time the haunting kind of lost its spark in some ways, and we don't know why that is. Now later on, the psychical researcher Andrew Mackenzie had noted, well, there were several other sightings of the spectral widow that occurred many years later. This was many decades later. Although we have to be a little careful about those kinds of reports, because by that time the story of the spectral widow was well known within the local area of Cheltenham where it occurred. And so we can't exclude the possibility that some of these experiences were influenced by people's knowledge in the back of their heads of what took place there, and knowing that there was reports of a spectral widow occurring back in the 19th century. But if we assume for the moment that at least a few of those more recent sightings are reliable, we also might note that even those sightings are relatively few in number. We don't see too many of them anymore, and so the question is why is that? Why doesn't a haunting keep going on, at full force? Why does it seem to have kind of a decrease over time? Another finding from the case surveys from the 19th century comes from Edmund Gurney and Frederick Myers when they examined several of the reports in the case collection of the Society for Psychical Research. And one interesting thing that they found was that spontaneous apparitional sightings or ghost sightings tend to decrease over the time when it comes to apparitions or ghosts of the dead. When they looked at these reports and looked at the timing of when they occurred, they found that the farther away in time, the more distant in time that the report occurred, it seemed that the number of reports started to fall off. And so the farther away in time from the moment of death that the report occurred, the less likely it seems that the reports surfaced of the apparitional figure of the deceased person was seen. And this was particularly interesting too, because then when I looked at the case reports that were described by Erlander Haraldson in his previously mentioned book, he had noted that same thing as well. When I plotted his data, it was interesting that as time went by on a longer time frame, for Gurney and Myers, it was over the course of 1 year. When we look at the Haraldson's data, but on a longer time frame over the course of many years, we also find a similar decreasing trend in the number of reports as time goes by. If we extrapolate this a little bit to hauntings, maybe this might also be perhaps a hint that, you know, some hauntings may not last indefinitely. They do have kind of a limit, it seems, a limit in time. And it's interesting to note along this along this line a similar parallel between this and also the observation that have been made by other psychical researchers, that there tends to be a decrease in quality of the spontaneous cases over time. And by quality, meaning the figures. This kind of ties back to the issue, well, why are the ghostly figures that we hear about today so much different from the ones we hear about in the 19th century? The 19th century, there was way more reports of apparitional figures that are very detailed and very, you know, human form, but yet we don't see too many of those now. It seems when people report having apparitional experiences in the modern time, it seems to be more along the lines of what we see in the photographs, where they are describing really indistinct forms that are kind of misty or shadowy or kind of orb-like stuff, and so that kind of raises the question: well, where have all the good cases gone in some respects? And that's a very important question for which we still do not yet have a good answer. And so you kind of also might wonder too, well, is this somewhat akin to the decrease in psychic performance over time that we see sometimes occurring in the laboratory, the so-called decline effect? We see that there have been a number of instances in which some people who seem to be psychically adept and have demonstrated their abilities in laboratory experiments, sometimes they might seem to lose their abilities over time. One example that I rarely think of is Pavel Stepanek. He seemed to have a good run of performance in laboratory studies of ESP, but over time he seemed to lose his ability, and we still don't really know why. So if we extrapolate this same type of thing too, when it comes to detailed figures, if they're mediated through ESP, then is a similar kind of thing happening in spontaneous cases as well. And when it comes to more modern day haunts, we kind of might ask the question, are some real popular modern day haunts simply carried on through expectation, suggestion, and or legend promotion? And this really comes to the forefront when it comes to issues like the kinds of phenomena reported in legend tripping and paranormal tourism, when people try to adopt the viewpoint, well, I'll believe it when I see it, and they try to follow that and go to certain places to check out the site and see if they can have an experience for themselves. One example that I can think of to cite here is this one involving the Queen Mary. Previously, in years past, there were quite a few reports aboard the Queen Mary that involved some very interesting, kind of almost human-like figures that were very detailed. But more recently in these reports, it seems to me that a lot of them just aren't as good anymore. But yet there's still a lot of hype about the alleged haunting of the Queen Mary, both in books and also among the media themselves when it comes to about what was experienced aboard the ship. And so even though there's a lot of hype, one might ask, well, are there really any genuine phenomena really still occurring? Because a lot of the reports that, at least for me, that I've been hearing about the Queen Mary, they don't seem to really be as good quality as they were in years past. And so that would kind of make me wonder, well, is the haunting still going on? Might have it had reached its limit, perhaps, but because of the way it's being hyped, maybe, and also through the expectations that people might have based on the rumors that it's haunted and the stories in the past, maybe that's it's kind of being carried on in an artificial way. Even though genuine phenomena may not be occurring, perhaps they are having experiences which they, because of the circumstances, they are actually interpreting themselves as ordinary experiences that they're interpreting as paranormal experiences. So we have to be kind of a little careful about that situation as well. So the take-home lesson here might be, well, we have to be mindful of witness reports, and we have to examine the quality of them and how recent has anybody experienced anything at the reputedly haunted site, and also how detailed was it, and was it simply kind of just a simple unnerving feeling, or was it simply seeing a very misty and indistinct figure, or was it an actual instance where they seemed to perceive a very detailed figure, and also maybe received information we didn't know at the time. So those are things we have to consider in terms of whether we should visit a particular haunted site that has a history of being haunted. Maybe if we take into consideration whether the haunting is still occurring, that might also kind of affect our chances too of having a ghostly experience. Let's see here. It's like there we go. Yeah, and so basically it's a question. Well, is it hype, or is it more genuine? The next lesson that we might look at is there any basis to urban ghost myths and legends? And the example that I'll cite here is one that I've heard about in my local southwestern region. We see that a lot of the ghost hunting shows that are on TV now, they tend to emphasize haunts that have a tragic history. Usually there's a tragic history associated with the reputedly haunted place. But when we look at some of the surveys of case reports from the psychical research literature, we find that only a fraction of them tend to have such an association. When she surveyed several cases from the case collection of the Society for Psychical Research, Eleanor Sidgwick had found that, well, the evidence connecting ghostly appearances with a crime or tragedy is extremely slight. When we look at other surveys too, we find that they tend to range anywhere from about 36 to 48% at best, with cases that seem to have a tragic component to them. Now, that's a considerable number, but it's also important to recognize that it's not an overwhelming majority. So it's approaching 50-50. So when you come to a case, it kind of suggests that, well, maybe it has a tragic history with it, but it also may not. So it's also equally possible that it may not. There's a few of them that might have some basis. One of them I can think of to cite here is a case that has been investigated by my late mentor, William Roll. And involving Dragsholm Castle in Denmark. This was a castle that was built in the 13th century and has quite a history of its own. It had multiple uses throughout its extensive history. It served as a fortress, a bishop's residence, and in the case of kind of a tragic history, it also served as a prison. And it's long said to be haunted by 3 ghosts, and one of them is the White Lady. Her story is associated with the legend of a tragic love affair involving the count of the area who lived many years ago. The White Lady was said to be the count's daughter, and her father had arranged for her to be married to the son of another noble family. But unfortunately, the daughter instead fell in love with a commoner, the castle's stable boy. And at first her father seemed to be okay with it, but then he said, well, that's fine, but when it comes time for the wedding to occur, you're going to have to break it off because you are betrothed to this other son of this other noble family. So you'll have to end it. And that was kind of the agreement that was reached. But unfortunately, the daughter later became pregnant by the stable boy, and this enraged the count. And reportedly, through his fit of rage, he had the stable boy killed, and he also entombed his daughter in the walls of the castle. And so this was kind of the folklore that was associated with the White Lady and the experiences that were reported in Dragsholm Castle, well, in relation to her. And so it raises the question, well, is that fact or is it folklore? For the longest time, it was assumed that it was folklore, but until more recent times, when an effort was made to renovate some of the restrooms on one of the upper floors of the castle, the restoration crew had to access the pipes, the septic pipes that were connected to the restrooms that were running through the walls, and so they had to break into the walls and to access them. And at some point, a very gruesome discovery was made. They had found a skeleton behind one of these false walls, and it seemed to be in line. It was the skeleton of a female, which seemed to be in line with the legend of the White Lady. And so that raises the question too: is this person, this female that was found, is this really tied to the White Lady, or can there be other aspects of the White Lady story that can be accountable by other means? Some of the investigations that my mentor William Roll had conducted at Dragsholm Castle seemed to suggest that the castle had some unique geophysical properties to it, not only in terms of the geologic and geophysical properties, but also in terms of the structure itself, which might also account for some of these, as an alternate possibility, might account for some of the experiences that people have there. And so there is kind of some aspects based on this that seem to be in line with the story of the White Lady, but then there's also some aspects too that which might be folklore, but are instead being influenced by other factors that might alternately account for their experiences. But then on the other side too, there are a number of urban ghost legends and myths that may not really have too much basis to them as compared to the case for Dragsholm. And this is the example that I can cite here from my local southwestern area in the neighboring state of Texas. There's a long legend concerning a school bus tragedy on the train tracks. There is a rural crossing in San Antonio, Texas, that has that is associated with the story of a school bus that had broken down on a railroad grade crossing. and was actually hit and killed a number of the kids that were aboard the bus when a train, a high-speed train, which could not stop fast enough, slammed into it. And ever since then, it's been said that, well, that particular railroad crossing is haunted by the children who were killed in that terrible accident, and it's partially associated with a certain type of phenomenon that some people have reported at that grade crossing, where they would drive up towards the grade crossing and then turn off their car and then put it in neutral, and then some people would say that once they did that, they would suddenly start to feel their vehicle start to move, and it would slowly gain speed and eventually run over the crossing and be moved to the other side without them doing anything to it. And later on, when they got out, they would find these what they claimed to be tiny little handprints on the back of their vehicle, which on that bit led them to think that, well, maybe what is happening here is that the ghosts of the little children who died in the tragedy, maybe they're pushing the vehicle across the crossing to make sure that it avoids the same fate that they experienced. And so this has the makings for an interesting ghost story on the surface, but there's a certain issue with it, and it comes from a finding from an investigator that I know who lives in Illinois. Ghost hunter Dan Norvell has done a number of videos on his own investigations of hauntings, and one series of videos that he's done is called "Lifting the Veil: Haunted or Not," in which he has gone to certain sites associated with ghost legends in his local area of Illinois to try and see for himself whether there might be anything to these legends or not, or whether they might be folklore. And in one of those videos, he basically said, well, there's this bridge here in my area of northern Illinois that is associated with a bus accident on the train tracks. And he also mentioned, well, there are also reports in relation to this bridge that when people drive onto it and then they shut off their car and put it in neutral, they start to roll off the bridge. And some people think that the ghosts of the people who perished in the accident are actually pushing the vehicle off the bridge. And when I heard about that, I said, wow, that's very similar to what we hear about in the San Antonio rural grade crossing. That's almost the same story. And so that made me wonder, well, could this sort of be a traveling urban legend? Is it not limited to one place? Maybe this story has kind of spread around into other parts of the country. And indeed, when it comes to the issue, well, did such a tragedy occur sometime in the past? And we find, if you look into the archival newspaper reports, you find that yes, there was such a tragedy that occurred, but it didn't occur in either of these places. It took place in Utah, and so it kind of suggested, well, maybe this legend associated with the train crossings has kind of spread about. It's gone to other places, and so it really is a legend that's been spread around by word of mouth, basically. And it's it's gone through a little bit of distortion, as in the case with Ghost Hunter Dan. His is associated with a bridge rather than an actual grade crossing, but it still has many aspects that are consistent with this with these other reports here. So that seems to raise the possibility that this kind of ghostly report may be an urban legend, and that's also added by that it's a legend that's been spread about through folklore, and also through other interpretations of ordinary physical phenomena. These kinds of experiences that have been described seem to be a form of what's been called anti-gravity hills or spook hills, which are raised areas of land that are actually have an incline to them, but in some cases that incline may not be too clear. As we see along here on the right side, this is an image taken from Dan Norell's video on the bridge, and we can see that there is a sloping incline going downward, and that may be of what, when people are parking on the bridge and then just letting their vehicle roll, maybe it's rolling based on gravity. That seems to be a little bit clear here, but in some instances, based on the terrain and the way it's formed and the way we perceive it, it may not be too clear. And so it can kind of give the impression that it has no explanation, but because of the way we perceive it, our limitations of our perception, it's kind of giving us an illusion that the land is flat when it actually, in fact, has a slight incline to it, and that the vehicle is moving by gravity. But when you don't realize that and you can't perceive it easily, some other alternate and paranormal explanations may be evoked to try to account for that phenomenon. So the take-home lesson here would be it's a good idea to try to trace sources when it comes to certain myths and legends. Try to trace the sources as much as possible and see whether they might have any kind of substance to them, or whether they simply kind of simply urban myth and legend. And I'd also suggest too is taking an active approach, just as Jan Norvell did, and kind of check it out for yourself. Maybe go to these sites and see if there's anything to them that you can test for yourself. The next lesson has to do with the question, well, do ghosts only appear at night or in total darkness? A lot of the ghost hunting shows really make a big deal about this. They kind of seem to always display investigations that are occurring at night or in total darkness, and kind of it seems to be based on kind of the folkloric idea that, well, ghosts, they tend to be more common during the night than they are during the day. But if we look at some of the surveys from the psychical research literature, we find that this may not matter very much at all. In her survey that she did of the Society for Psychical Research collection, Eleanor Sidgwick had found that, well, sightings occur in all kinds of light, from broad daylight to the faint light of dawn. Psychical researcher Andrew Mackenzie had actually devoted a whole chapter to cases of apparitional sightings that occurred in daylight or in dusk conditions, where it was starting to get night, but there was still enough light left from the setting sun that allowed the witnesses to see fairly clearly. And so it wasn't pitch black darkness. There was still enough light to see. And he found several cases, not only in the Society for Psychical Research collection, but also in some cases of his own, that there were quite a few cases of this type that have occurred. Erlander Haraldson also found a considerable amount too. He found that, well, roughly half of the cases that he surveyed occurred in daylight, or they occurred in lighted conditions. They occurred in rooms where there was full lighting, or at least partial lighting, and so the apparitions still occurred even though there was bright light. One illustrative example that we might cite here from the Society for Psychical Research collection is the case of the scratched cheek. And this is a case that involved a salesman who was traveling on business. And while he was staying in a hotel in St. Louis, Missouri, he was working at a desk in his hotel room and trying to get his daily business done, when he suddenly had a kind of an unusual sense of presence. And when he turned to look to his left, he saw the figure of his deceased sister, who had died of cholera several years before. But one interesting thing he noticed when he looked at the figure is that she had a small scratch running along the side of her cheek, which seemed unusual. But the sudden appearance of this figure had startled him, and he jumped up to greet her. But when he did that, the figure simply disappeared, and he was left bewildered by that. Later on, when he returned home, he told his family about the experience that he had, and upon hearing it, his mother had nearly fainted. And when she finally came to, she said, I haven't told anybody about this, but after your sister had died, I was preparing her body for burial, and I accidentally scratched her cheek with a sharp instrument. And I tried to cover it up to make sure that nobody could see it. I put a lot of cosmetic material over it to make sure it wouldn't be seen. So, and she didn't tell anybody about this. So it was something unknown to him. But yet the salesman, when he witnessed his sister's figure, he saw this mark on her cheek. And it seemed to correspond with something that had actually occurred, but was outside his knowledge at that time, suggesting a veridical component that makes this experience very, very interesting. And in terms of the issue here, the one interesting thing is that this apparitional experience occurred in broad daylight. The salesman had said in his account, he said, well, when I saw this figure of my sister, the hour was high noon. So it was broad daylight when he had this experience. And so from here, the take-home lesson would be, well, it sounds funny, but don't be afraid of the light. There's no harm at all in doing an investigation during the day or in lighted rooms. It doesn't seem that it's going to be harmful in terms of affecting your chances of encountering a ghost based on these findings. Lastly, let's take a look at this lesson here. Are haunted places necessarily old and run down? This is another thing that kind of goes with the ghost hunting shows, where they kind of oftentimes seem to focus on places that are really old, run down, and just are often abandoned. And so, based on folklore, one might tend to think, well, that's the kind of situation where one might expect to find a ghost. But is that really the case? Based on the survey that she did in 1885, Eleanor Sidgwick found that, we find no foundation for the very general idea that ghosts haunt old houses, or even mainly. And even in more modern surveys, we can kind of see that too. Late Tony Carnell had pointed out, well, one usually expects to find ghosts in old houses, but many cases disprove this rule. When an apparition is seen in a new building that has no history of haunting, one must look for the cause elsewhere. An example we might cite here specifically was a case cited by James Hyslop, who was the head of the American Society for Psychical Research around the turn of the 20th century. And he pointed to a case that had been originally reported by the late psychical researcher Richard Hodgson, involving a family who had moved into an apartment building, and the mother of the family started having unusual experiences in relation to one particular room in that apartment. And one thing that was noticed there is that, well, this is quite in contrast to kind of that stereotypical folkloric view we have of a haunted house, because this was a brand new building. This was a brand new apartment complex. Nobody had previously lived in it, and as far as they know, there was no trace of any tragedy or death or anything like that that occurred. So this occurred in a brand new building. We also might look at the presentation that was given by our esteemed Japanese researcher Hideyuki Kokubo in this Paramook previously as well, when he described one of the cases in his involving the Tomiko-cho case, which was an apartment building also that was relatively brand new. It had only been built the year before. Some of the families in the who lived there were actually started reporting haunt or poltergeist type phenomena. So this was another case where we had a relatively new building, which seemed seemingly in contrast with that stereotype of a haunted house. We also might be mindful too that due to their condition, a lot of old buildings can be quite susceptible to a number of structural defects and exposure to the elements, and these can oftentimes produce a lot of ordinary factors that, under the conditions and circumstances, because of rumors of haunting, people might misinterpret as being paranormal when they actually have an ordinary normal factor. So the take-home lesson here would be we might be cautious about a lot of the haunt reports that come from old buildings, because they may be more normal than paranormal. So to tie kind of, these are just to tie things up, these are kind of a few just lessons that I wanted to bring up that have a few kind of good reasons behind them. I think when you take things to consideration like this, they can help sort fact from folklore, especially when it comes to a lot of the popular claims made by the media about ghosts and hauntings. And it may be wise to employ some critical thinking when it comes to those claims being made in the media. But then, when it comes to these lessons here, you certainly don't have to take my word for it. I would encourage a lot of ghost hunters and other people in the paranormal community to try out these lessons for themselves to see whether or not there might actually be any kind of substance to them. I think perhaps that would be helpful in the long run. Maybe then that might, if there's something to them, then they might help keep you from chasing white sheets rather than ghosts. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions or any comments, then please put them in the chat, or feel free to come on and video and audio and share them with us. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bryan. It was really interesting a conversation. And I loved how you were wandering in and out of all of the literature from back in the day to frequently, more recently. Darcy, I was going to ask your question, but you're on the video, so you can ask it yourself.
All right, yeah. You were talking about the vivid apparitional accounts back in the 1800s, 1900s, in the full body apparitions, very human-like, very. Do you think that the popularity of the spiritualist movement kind of programmed people to see entities in that way?
That's a good question. You could kind of look at it, I suppose, in a view, because of that at that time, the idea of survival was really big, and so a lot of the phenomena were phrased in that context. But then you look at the details too, especially when it comes to haunts and to hauntings and stuff like that. They contain details that people weren't aware of at the time. Especially when it came to haunting apparitions. And so if they were being kind of being led through suggestion or expectation, the question would be, how would they account for that? And so it's quite possible that some of them might have been come through suggestion and expectation, but there are also some that might not. So
yeah, as a field investigator, I see that oftentimes when I come in, that there's an expectation of what I am to do and what I am to find. And that gets a little frustrating. And you know, popular media has kind of led to that expectation too, that all hauntings are negative, all hauntings are physical, all hauntings have to have this kind of substance, or otherwise it's not right. And I have a hard time explaining to some clients, like, they're not all bad, they're not all negative, sometimes they're very benign. But oh no, there's a strong expectation, and they won't accept any other thing unless I'm aligning with what their programming has been. So I just brought that up.
And actually, that original point that she was making about the impact of spiritualism was in general a very positive influence, in the sense of believing in the afterlife and being able to have communication with your family members and so on, that maybe there was less of an expectation that if I see a ghost, this is going to be something horrific, I have to run away immediately, or as opposed to being an experience where you might be able to watch what was happening or communicate with your loved one or whatever. The thing that came across my mind was we're so used to seeing all of these depictions in movies and videos and so many things that even when we're big readers, we have a tendency to kind of formulate our inner visual of what we're reading in a way that references all of the stuff that we get from, media and from fiction and all that kind of stuff. And I wonder if that's impacted our ability to have a rich visual, imaginative response to some things, that maybe back in the day you were used to reading and filling your head with these wonderful images that you weren't seeing everywhere, and filling in the gaps in what you were seeing as well. Whereas now we're getting spoon-fed with all these images that we get in different ways. So
I think that's entirely possible too. I remember too, and that's a good point you make, Darcy, about a lot of times these phenomena are the media depictions kind of drill in the idea that they have to be negative experiences. But when you look at it, there was that observation that Martin Ebon, the former secretary of the Parapsychology Foundation, had made, and he basically said, well, media and fictional accounts notwithstanding, the usual experience with the ghost is no more different than and no more scary than encountering a stranger on the street. Yeah. It's only when you actually later on realize that you actually saw a ghost that the impact really occurs. Sometimes they can be a little bit frightening, usually because they're disorienting and bewildering. But I don't really hear a lot of accounts, in especially of full body figures, where they said that it was a bone-chillingly frightening experience, like the media likes to paint it to be. So if you look at some of the other case surveys, several of them actually describe it as being a rather positive or maybe even a comforting experience. You look at Diane Archangel's, for example. That's one of the most recent surveys that was done, and she said, well, there's quite a few of them who were comforted by the encounter they had with the apparition of their deceased loved one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It always reminds me of Nathaniel Hawthorne's experience with his neighbor, looking up at the library table over his newspaper, and there's that guy that passed away and used to always be at that one chair with the sunlight on him reading his newspaper. And it was a comforting kind of experience. It wasn't something that made him back up, drop his newspaper and run screaming from the library. It was a calm, kind of comforting experience to see him still there. So yeah, it's interesting. We've got let's see there. Pascal was saying there's a difference you can find between anthropologists' work and psi researchers. The anthropologists will say that the ghosts always happen at night, and what they're referring to are imaginary stereotypes, while parapsychologists will use testimonies and surveys and analyses of witness reports, and then you get this more complex kind of understanding of what these experiences are. And Cindy is saying, I wonder if instead of seeing ghosts, it's the difference between seeing ghosts or being sold a ghost. You know?
Yes, I would think so, especially in the modern day here with the
Yeah,
media influence. Yes.
yeah, definitely. And after the fact, is that it's hard to swallow sometimes, like, what? But what did this happen? How did this happen? Kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what Martin Ebon was pointing at. He said, "Well, it's a very kind of disorienting experience, and it just comes out of the blue. It's unexpected, and it kind of uh, they sometimes feel very puzzled, and um, that's where kind of the shock value it seems kind of comes seems to occur, but it's not something that just like totally causes them to scream and run. It would seem to me. Now there are cases where some people have described that they're just because of the way they reacted, but it doesn't seem to me that that's a really overwhelming majority of people.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that it isn't really what you read when you read the literature, or when you get a lot of people telling you about what's going on, or like Darcy and Allison and a lot of these folks that are doing, Lloyd as well, doing a lot of these different investigations. I mean, Lloyd's got that case where the young man was basically mentored for his entire, from being a small child to being a young adult, by the ghost in the house, and had no problem having conversations with her and learning from her and so on. And the relationship, his relationship and others' relationship with the Moss Beach distillery ghost. So you see these different kinds of things that are more feel more normal and more comforting and more just carry on in a positive way. I think that's very interesting. Darcy, I when I heard you talk to, I was thinking about, it's such a pain in the butt when when, pardon my French, when the when you've got somebody that comes to you for help with an experience, or comes to you to see what it's like to be a ghost hunter and so on, and they don't have the ability to actually listen to the person who's been doing this for 20 years because so and so on such and so show on the Discover Channel says that it's something else. And there's such an impact by the media producers and all that stuff on what's portrayed to us, that it's got to be frustrating to have to say, it's not like that, and then they're not willing to hear that.
Yeah, I had two different times where we went into a house, and the owners were absolutely adamant whenever there was a demon. Oh. And I'm like, oh, and they had like Catholic altars all over the house.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm like, well, I can understand why you might feel that way. Just let me bring in, and I brought in two mediums. One had a background in the Catholic Church, and another one did not. And neither one could pick up on any negativity whatsoever. The owner still would not accept that there was anything short of a demon in that house. And I'm like, I can give you a third party if you like, but I just don't really know what else to tell you. But
yeah, exactly. People have their own ideas. I went on two actually and managed to get dragged off. I was usually, pretending I was sick or something if John Biza and Brenda Dunn were going to go investigate something. But there was one that we went on with a different group. At that point, I was teaching parapsychology at Northeastern Illinois University. It was a group of my students. And we went out because somebody had gotten in touch with one of the students, and the person had been a monk and had fallen in love with his wife and left the community and was feeling guilty about that. And the daughter was they had she thought she was a poltergeist agent because of what she was hearing in her room and that kind of thing. And eventually another group talked to her, and it was clear that she was kind of doing what she thought her father wanted her to do. She was like 12, 13. and throwing things and pretending she was seeing things and all this stuff. And he was absolutely convinced that God was punishing him for leaving the monastery to marry the mom. And clearly they'd been together a while because the kid was, a preteen, and he just couldn't get over it. We ended up actually talking to a priest that I knew from my high school, who was a pretty liberal, and well-read kind of a person, to see if he couldn't find somebody to go and counsel him, because he was just making the whole overlay of what was going on in that family was really complicated and didn't seem to have anything to do with anything paranormal. So it's like it's expectations can be pretty weird.
Yeah.
And
sometimes they'll go through multiple investigators until they hear what they want.
Right, exactly.
And
finding
that's kind of
looking for the person to agree with them. Yeah. It's interesting. It's very interesting. And I liked I don't know if you you wouldn't have seen, I don't know if you were in Beth Hedva's talk, and I'm still working on the video, so I haven't uploaded it yet.
No.
But the way that she was handling that case, and it had multiple people, Jerry Solfin was involved with it, and Lloyd Auerbach and so on. It was very much resonant to the Rogo thing, where you're in there for a purpose, and the purpose is to help people get what they need, in terms of deal with this and get rid of the ghost one way or the other, or make peace with the ghost one way or the other, or whatever. And it was really interesting, that one as well. That one had real phenomena happening, but it was very much part of the dynamic. I had some Catholic friends in Chicago who were Irish, and the priest was very upset that the kids were mentioning that there was this guy up in the attic who they would hear periodically, and the house did have a history of the original owner killing himself in the top floor bedroom. And the kids decided, what the heck? This happens to everybody. We've heard this from, Aunt this and Uncle that. So they would just talk to him. Once they had a name for it, they would come up and say, "Hey, Joe, how you doing? What's going on? Oh, stop making that noise. Well, I'm trying to sleep," kind of thing. And it got very kind of normalized in that kind of way. And I don't think they ever stopped having occasional, sounds and things that they related to that man's demise, but they weren't afraid of it by any stretch of the imagination. And the priest was kind of horrified that they weren't taking this seriously enough, get rid of that ghost. You never know. Randy is saying, my experience has been that when you try to actually validate the romantic tragedy that folks believe is the cause of hauntings, even at locations where it appears that genuine anomalous phenomena sometimes occurs, it turns out the alleged trigger event or personalities never actually existed. Yeah. And looking at all of I know you guys are putting together a really large database of these kinds of experiences. Are you seeing that, that in terms of the investigators trying to find the cause that the experiencers are pointing to, that's not, you can't find that, there's no evidence that's the real story?
Yeah. Most of the ones I've been looking at so far have been the data has been more kind of physical based, and that's been kind of a little bit of the problem, because it doesn't take as much into the experiential side as much. But yeah, when you look at that, as I kind of mentioned here, you kind of have to look at it with a little bit of a critical eye to make sure that there really is some kind of substance there, and not something that not some type of folklore that has kind of ballooned a little bit in terms of being distorted or embellished through frequent retelling and things like that. That might such that it starts to take on a life of its own, even though it's not a ghost in the purest sense. It's kind of a more of a kind of.
I was wondering too, in a lot of the old, I'll shut up in a second, Randy, I promise. Like in a lot of the old, very old experiences, people will talk about, they see an apparition, but they also see the room in the way that it was when that person that they're identifying was there, kind of thing. That there's something about the chair the person is sitting in, or as they walk across the room, it's like they're walking across the previous room, that kind of thing. So do you see that in the modern stuff?
Very rarely. I only know of a few cases where we've seen that kind of place memory type of thing. Those real veridical experiences, those tend to be really, really rare now. And then that always raises the question. It's an intriguing question for me: is why is that? Why don't we see cases like vertical cases like we used to see, back in the 19th century and things like that? Why has there been such an apparent decline of them? There could be multiple factors, but I kind of wonder if, as I mentioned here, whether it might, if they're psi related, related to psychic phenomena, then maybe they might have a decline aspect of their own, perhaps. That's one possibility among many, but I do kind of wonder,
Yeah, exactly. Well, Randy, what did you want to say?
With the folklore stories that don't pan out when you actually do the research of the records, that occurs in places that really do appear to be haunted or have a ghost. It seems like the phenomena is observed first, and then the romantic story is built up after the fact to try to give a neat Hollywood or storybook start and finish to what causes it. But I found in most of those places, historical locations, Native American haunted areas, you look at the story of the woman in white who jumped off the cliff because her lover was killed. Those don't pan out, even though people are experiencing legitimate phenomena in those cases. And just on what Bryan was mentioning, how come we're not seeing the same things today that we were, in the 1800s? If there is a looking at it like John Keel, Jacques Vallée, and others look at this overarching phenomena, there may be an underlying real anomalous phenomena, but we are culturally perceiving it and experiencing it differently over different periods based on what we can comprehend and what our culture and society says can happen. It used to be leprechauns and fairies. Then it was full-bodied apparitions. Now today, maybe it's weird light formations and glowing balls of light or wispy fogs. Who knows what we'll be seeing 100 years from now?
Yeah, that's true. That there's a cultural aspect to this, and how we perceive stuff. That's interesting. So it could be the same stimulus, but what we do with that perceptually is dependent on where we live and who we are and what seems possible now. That's a good point. And Darcy's saying the Lemp Mansion is a prime example of that. Perception changes with time. So Darcy, you want to come back on and tell us about Lemp Mansion? That's not one
yeah, I actually went there a couple of times, and of course everybody had heard the stories about the Lemp Mansion and the curse of depression amongst all the Lemp family members and how they committed horrible suicide. And I went to talk to one of the researchers in the area who was a genealogist, and they said, well, this one was a bona fide suicide. This one was a suspected murder.
Yeah.
Because he was shot twice in the chest with an Army carbine. You can't shoot yourself once in the chest with an Army carbine. So, and that was during the bootleg, Prohibition era. So that was more likely the chance there. The third one was a domestic violence possibility because he had divorced the husband under such psychological trauma and then remarried him. Oh. And then he found her. His first call was to his lawyer. The second call was to the police. The third call was to the family. So there was a lot of question there. Was that one a suicide or not? But then the third one, of course, was a suicide because he left a note. But that doesn't mean that was what the haunting was. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of haunting in the whole building. We picked up on a lot of that when we were in the building and conducting our own investigation, but it didn't align with the stories. So they did have activity, but it just didn't align with the romantic version, like Randy was saying, of what
Yeah.
the commercial owners were selling it as.
Right, exactly. That's interesting too, that there's experience, there's phenomena there, but it's gotten contextualized in a way that doesn't fit the facts. And then it's hard to get that out of your head too. So that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes
Yeah,
sense.
that's a good point. It's a good point you make there, Darcy. That's what you see with Dragstone Castle too when it comes to the White Lady. The phenomena that they report there a lot of times are kind of a little bit, they're not so clear in terms of the apparition. They kind of describe the apparition of the White Lady as kind of like a white mist, and sometimes some people have reported phantom screams and stuff like that. And you kind of wonder, there is phenomena occurring there, but are they interpreting it in terms of certain cultural expectations relating to the story, the legend of the White Lady? Could it be natural geophysical phenomena that's being misinterpreted as being in a paranormal context? That's certainly a very important consideration to make when it comes to a lot of these really well-known and repeatedly haunted locations.
Yes, precisely. Thank you.
It's fascinating. It's really fascinating. And I love that the course has been both honoring the experiences as well as coming with ideas that investigators need to keep in mind in terms of how you decide what the experience is, what you're investigating, whether or not you can take the explanations for the phenomena as a context that's going to work for you in terms of the investigation, or if you have to separate the actual phenomena you're getting described from the context that the experiencers are giving you and try to figure out, okay, so how is this like other types of apparitional experiences or haunting experiences or whatever? Because sometimes it's like it reminds me a little bit of what Joe McMoneagle would always say about remote viewing, is that you couldn't go into a remote viewing experiment with a lot of preconceptions, and the part of the training that was the most important was to describe what you were visualizing without contextualizing it or deciding what it was before you finished the description. That the description itself was really important, but it might not be, your interpretation of what the description means may not actually be correct, or it might obscure certain bits and pieces of evidence that you're not trying to obscure, you're trying to get it out, in a way that people will understand it. But if you're so quick at interpreting it, you may send them off on a totally different place. And especially when they were doing it, kind of investigating it as a way to do safe from the office spying, essentially, it would be really important not to interpret what you were describing, but rather just describing them as specifically as you could without putting in some kind of overlay of what you cognitively think that might be. So I always thought that was really hard to do, not only for the viewer, but for the person working with the viewer and taking down the details, to try and focus on the details and not on the interpretations. Because as human beings, we just want to interpret everything that, shows up and come up with an explanation as fast as possible, and then put it in a context that we can live with, as opposed to sort of stick at that point where you're just describing, just observing.
Yeah. And recognizing, again, as I mentioned, that you have your own sort of personal beliefs and opinions and perspectives, and how that might shape how you perceive a certain event and interpret it as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And be a little bit more aware of that, and try to let that not influence your interpretation and perception too much.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Darcy's saying that's in their remote viewing class, that's what they learned: write first, edit later, and that mediums and psychics have that problem too. How do I take in this piece of information and not kind of put a story on it that's coming from me? My brother is an atheist, and he's not not crazy about religion, but he's also not crazy about spiritualism and in all these kinds of beliefs. once had a conversation about the afterlife, and I said, well, for me, it's a choice. I'm perfectly happy to believe in this at the moment because I need that, right now, and I don't feel like it's going to harm me in any way, because if there's no such thing, I'm never going to know. So this is a context that I understand that I can't completely provide evidence for, but it's something that I'm very happy to take on at the moment, and to hold it in an ambiguous space where, okay, that might be what's happening and that might not be what's happening, but I like that. I like that description, and it helps me psychologically. So I'm going to just go ahead and choose that, knowing that I'm choosing it without, incredibly convincing evidence. I couldn't turn around and say that, well, it's like the reincarnation reports. More than happy to believe that to hold that as an ambiguity too, that they look like what they seem to be. But I wouldn't turn around and say to somebody, well, we've proved that this happens, and that's the same thing with afterlife experiences. And I mean, I haven't had a lot of them, but the one that I had this wonderful, later I thought it was wonderful, kind of argument going on in my brain, the brain saying, oh, I'm seeing this. And the other part of the brain is saying, no, you're imagining this and you just put it out there and it makes you happy. And it's like, okay, either one. There's a difference between the experience and what it does for you and the evidence that this is what the current explanation might be. And it is possible the whole, if you're okay with ambiguity, and for some reason I love ambiguity, and most of my scientific friends and don't. I feel like but I know that it's an ambiguity. It's something that I'm choosing to think at the moment because it's psychologically adaptive for me. And but I certainly can't turn around and say, no, well, we've proved that this is true. Well, there's lots of experiences, but there's lots of experiences that can be also interpreted in a lot of different ways. Like Bill Roll's thing about the ambience of the location and what it looks like and what it reminds you of and all that kind of stuff. So it's just fascinating, but it's still important to keep the experiences, honor the experiences, especially at the first taking, so that you can get those details and then see later how they fit the pattern or what the pattern might emerge from those kinds of information and those kinds of experiences. So it's a very, very interesting and a very wonderfully complicated area of thought that has so many implications. And I think it's really good that we all know each other, and we all are taking different ways of looking at it, and that this is not an experience that's going to go away. It's been with us as human beings for so long. It's just part of who we are, and we still have a lot to learn about it. So that's a pretty cool thing. Well, does anybody else have any comments or questions? I do recommend Ghost as opposed to Haunting of Hill House, the series. It's really well done, but oh my God, they have a very stereotypical and negative view of who's haunting what at what time and how they do it. Yeah, Brian and Darcy says, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure. And it is. I love the way that you dive into these areas and you pull out an enormous amount of very good information and then look at it in a very logical and a very systematic way. And that puts us all on a better footing in terms of how we have these experiences, how we interpret them, and then how we go forward in investigating them too. So, well, thank you guys. So Brian, have you something that you would like to say for as the last word before we take a look at the last two things that are going to happen? People are booking out the door at the moment. Not to worry, guys.
I don't really think so. I think you tied it up very well at the end here. So I'm a little more I can add to that and prolong it. So
Well, it was wonderful. It was really excellent and very, very interesting. And I'm glad you're the last word. So I'm not going to pull the thing back up again, but tomorrow we're having the closing session for Paramook 2023 at 3 p.m. Central. We're going to talk about what we've seen, what we've heard, and talk about maybe what you might want us to do next March. And then on Saturday, April 1st at 3 p.m. Central, we will have a discussion. The discussion is going to be privately recorded and just available on a link. I still haven't edited the first one, but I will have both of them done before the 10th of April, if not sometime earlier next week. But we're really winding down here, and I want to thank all of you guys for coming along, and everybody who's watching the videos, and any kind of comments you want to make, please do so. And thank you very much, and thank you, Bryan.
thank you.
Okay, bye guys. Have a good rest of your day.